America just got hit by two disasters at the same time, and what happened next is honestly hard to believe. 7 people are dead. Over 100,000 homes still have no power. And right now, as you watch this, neither disaster is even finished yet. 2 huge water disasters hit the United States on the very same weekend, 4,000 miles apart from each other, and most people only heard about one of them on the news. One happened in the middle of the country, in Indiana, where a flood broke a record that had stood for 113 years, a record that survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression, and it got broken by rain alone. The other happened way out in the middle of the ocean, in Hawaii, where a hurricane never even touched land, and it still tore homes right off their foundations and knocked out power to more people than live in some entire cities. How does a storm that never makes landfall do that much damage? How does a flood beat a record that seemed impossible to beat? And why are officials in both places saying the real danger might not even be over yet? Stick with me, because by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly what happened in both places, why it was so dangerous, and why the people in charge of keeping America safe are still working around the clock right now. Before we get into it, if you find this kind of deep, careful reporting helpful, please hit like and subscribe. Videos like this take a lot of research and time to put together, and it really helps the channel grow. Okay, let's get into it. It all started on August 11th, 2026, when a system of powerful storms began rolling across the state of Indiana. What happened over the next 4 days was not just a flood. It was one of the most record-breaking, damaging, and historic rain events that state has ever seen. The National Weather Service said that some parts of Indiana got more than 11 inches of rain in only a couple of days. Just to picture that, 11 inches of rain is almost as tall as a basketball. The highest total came from a town called Newcastle, Indiana, where the rain gauge measured 11.43 inches. Another town, Greensburg, got more than 7 inches. Those numbers are scary on their own, but the real story is not just about how much rain fell. It is about what happens when that much rain falls on ground that is already completely full of water. In the days before August 11th, Indiana had already been hit by round after round of heavy storms. The soil was not just wet, it was soaked all the way through. There was nowhere left for any more water to go. This is the single most important idea for understanding everything that happened next. When the ground is already full of water, almost none of any new rain can soak into the soil. Nearly all of it runs straight off the surface and pours into the nearest river or stream. So when those 11 inches of rain fell between August 11th and August 13th, it did not act like normal rain. It acted like 11 inches of water poured directly into the river with absolutely nowhere else to go. Let's slow down on that ground saturation idea for a second, because it is the single most important science lesson in this entire story. And once you understand it, everything else about the Indiana flood makes perfect sense. Picture a kitchen sponge sitting on a countertop. When that sponge is dry, it can soak up a huge amount of water. Pour a cup of water onto a dry sponge, and most of that water disappears into the sponge itself. But now picture that same sponge after you have already poured cup after cup of water onto it. At some point, the sponge cannot hold one more drop. Pour another cup onto a fully soaked sponge, and the water does not soak in anymore. It just runs straight off the sponge and onto the counter. Indiana's soil in August of 2026 was exactly like that fully soaked sponge. Days of heavy rain before August 11th had already filled every gap in the ground with water. So when the next 11 inches came down, the ground had nothing left to give. It could not absorb a single extra drop. Every bit of that rain ran straight downhill into creeks, into ditches, and into the White River itself. That is why a rainfall total that might have caused only moderate flooding on dry ground turned into a flood that broke a 113-year-old record. The ground itself had become part of the disaster, not just the sky above it. The rivers took the full hit. The worst flooding gathered along the main part of the White River, flowing from Hamilton County down into the northern suburbs of Indianapolis. Several rivers across the state went under flood warnings at the very same time. Drone video from NBC News showed floodwaters completely swallowing streets in the Ravenswood neighborhood of Indianapolis. Cars were submerged all the way up to their roofs. Water rose right up to the front doors of people's homes. Residents had to paddle through their own neighborhoods in kayaks and rowboats just to get around. That is not just a flood. That is an entire inland sea appearing overnight inside a major American city. And then the White River did something that nobody alive had ever seen it do before. At a measuring point called the Anderson Gage Station, the river crested on Friday at 24.93 feet. The old record at that same spot was 23.6 feet, and that record had stood since 1913. Think about everything that happened between 1913 and now. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the building of the interstate highway system, the moon landing. Through all of that time, across more than a century of Indiana floods, nothing ever beat that old number. Until Friday, August 14th, 2026. Friday's flood crest beat the 1913 record by 1.33 feet. And upstream, near a town called Noblesville, about 15 miles north of Indianapolis, the river also smashed its own 1913 record, rising to a forecasted crest of 24.5 feet against an old record of 23.8 feet. Here's the part that makes this so shocking, and it is not just a scary number for a headline. The 1913 flood, the one that held the record for over 100 years, did not even happen in the summer. It was a spring flood. It happened because of melting snow mixed with heavy rain in late March. A massive storm dumped 6 to 11 inches of rain across Indiana, Ohio, and parts of Pennsylvania and Kentucky. And all of that rain landed on top of snow that was already melting into ground that was still partly frozen. That is about as much water stress as a river system can possibly face at once. Snow melting into frozen ground that cannot absorb anything, plus heavy rain falling right on top of it. That flood killed somewhere between 100 and 200 people in Indiana alone. It left more than 250,000 people homeless, and it became the second deadliest flood in United States history. For over 100 years, it was the benchmark. Every single flood after it was measured against that one event. The August 2026 flood beat it using rain alone. No melting snow, no frozen ground, no spring snowmelt already sitting in the river before the rain even started. August in Indiana is supposed to be the time of year when a river has the most room to handle extra water, because the ground is warm and there is no snow involved at all. The 1913 record was set with every possible advantage working in its favor. Every single factor that could make a flood worse was present back then. And a normal summer thunderstorm pattern just walked right past it anyway. That one detail should stop you in your tracks, because it means that all the infrastructure planning, the flood maps, the insurance calculations, the height of the levees, the design of the drainage systems, and even where roads were built so they would not flood, all of it was based on a number from 1913. And on that Friday, in August, that number stopped being the ceiling. It helps to compare this flood to things people already know. 11 inches of rain in a couple of days is more rain than some cities normally get across 3 or 4 entire months put together. Imagine taking all the rain a place would normally see from June through September and squeezing every drop of it down into just 48 hours. That is roughly what happened across parts of Indiana. And remember, this was not rain falling evenly and gently the whole time. Because of the training effect, where storm after storm rolled down the exact same path, the rain came in intense, repeated bursts, like a fire hose being turned on, turned off, and turned back on again over and over across the same small patch of ground. Rivers are built to handle a certain amount of water moving through them at once. When you suddenly ask a river to carry that many months' worth of rain in that short a window, the river has no choice but to spill out of its banks because there's simply nowhere else for all that water to go except up and outward, into streets, into yards, and into homes. The weather pattern that caused all of this is actually pretty simple to understand once you break it down. It was not some rare, exotic weather event. It was something called a stall, a boundary of weather, sometimes called a front, set up across the Midwest, and then it just stopped moving. Hot, wet air was pushing north from the Gulf of Mexico, while cooler air stayed put to the north of that boundary, and the two forces basically canceled each other out, so the front just parked in place and stayed there. At the same time, a high-pressure system sitting over the Gulf acted almost like a conveyor belt for moisture, pumping warm, water-loaded air northward, straight into that stuck boundary. Every little disturbance moving along the jet stream then set off a fresh batch of thunderstorms right along that same front. Because those storm cells were moving in a direction that crossed straight over the boundary, they kept rolling over the exact same counties again and again and again. Meteorologists actually have a name for this pattern. They call it training. The name describes exactly what it looks like. Storm after storm rolls down the same track, just like train cars following the same rails, and each one dumps its full load of rain onto the same soaked ground the storm before it just dropped rain on. A single storm that crosses a county in 40 minutes usually leaves behind a manageable amount of water. But that same kind of storm regenerating over and over across the same county for 2 straight days leaves behind a total catastrophe. And here is the wild part. No single storm in that whole chain had to be unusually strong for this to happen. The storms themselves were fairly normal. Only the geometry had to go wrong, meaning the front had to stop moving. And whether that boundary moves or stalls is what decides everything. The Great Flood of 1913 had this exact same failure. A storm system that stalled in place. 113 years apart, and Indiana got hit by the exact same weather mechanism both times. Now, let's talk about the people affected, because behind every one of these numbers is a real person and a real family. At least 7 people have died from flooding and storms across Indiana, according to the latest confirmed count. That number was 5 on Friday, climbed to 6 by Saturday, and was updated to 7 by Sunday. It is important to understand that this number could still change. Among those who died was an 18-year-old named Matthew Moray. He was about to start his freshman year at Purdue University. He and 3 friends went into the Mississippi River on Wednesday, right as the flooding was beginning. His body was found by the Delaware County Sheriff's Office 2 days later. A 4-year-old boy in Jennings County was killed when a tree crashed through the roof of his home during powerful winds. A 58-year-old woman died in Lake County. An 86-year-old woman died in Porter County. A 32-year-old man died in LaPorte County. A 31-year-old man died in Henry County. 7 people, regular people, living regular lives in regular Indiana towns, killed by water and wind that almost nobody expected to be this dangerous. The Indianapolis Fire Department alone rescued 95 people and 45 pets from floodwaters by late Saturday afternoon. That is just one city's fire department, working through a single afternoon. Rescue teams also carried out checks and rescues in Fayette County. An entire senior mobile home community in Tipton County had to be evacuated. National Guard soldiers worked side by side with local first responders on high water rescue missions across Indianapolis. Officials in Hamilton County called it historic flooding for their entire county. The president of the Hamilton County Board of Commissioners said on Sunday morning, and this is exactly what she said, "It is a good morning because it is not raining and the water is receding." Think about that for a second. Not raining and the water is finally going down. That is the bar for what counts as a good morning after a week like the one Indiana just had. It is also worth pausing on what it actually looks like when a fire department pulls 95 people and 45 pets out of rising water in a single afternoon. Each one of those 95 people is a separate rescue. That means a boat, or sometimes a truck built to drive through high water, has to reach a specific house, find the people trapped inside, get them safely into the vehicle, and then get them somewhere dry, before turning right back around and doing the exact same thing again for the next family. 45 pets means dogs and cats being carried through waist-deep or chest-deep water by rescuers who are already exhausted from carrying the person right before them. Multiply that kind of effort by every fire department, every police department, and every group of volunteers working across Hamilton County, Delaware County, Fayette County, Tipton County, Lake County, Porter County, LaPorte County, and Henry County, all at the same time, and you start to get a sense of just how enormous this response really was. This was not one dramatic rescue captured on camera. It was hundreds of rescues happening at once all across the state for days in a row by people who did not get to stop and rest until the water finally started going down. The governor of Indiana declared a statewide disaster emergency and asked for federal help. President Trump approved an emergency declaration for the state, and FEMA confirmed that federal disaster assistance would be made available. But here's something that really matters, and a lot of people do not understand the difference. An emergency declaration and a major disaster declaration are 2 completely different things. An emergency declaration is the smaller, faster tool. It unlocks up to $5 million in federal resources, and it is meant for immediate response. Things like moving people to safety, getting equipment where it needs to go, and keeping rescue operations running while the water is still high. $5 million is enough for an immediate response. It is not enough for actual recovery. And it is definitely not enough to rebuild an entire river corridor that just set a 113-year record flowing straight through the second largest metro area in the whole state. The bigger tool is called a major disaster declaration. That is the one that unlocks individual assistance for families whose homes were destroyed, along with public assistance to repair roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. To get there, officials first need to complete joint damage assessments in every affected county, and as of Monday, those assessments were still being done. Until those numbers come back, $5 million is all that is on the table, and $5 million against a flood that just rewrote the history books is simply not enough money. The flooding did not stop in Indiana either. By Sunday night and into Monday, the heavy rain had spread east and started causing new problems. Flooding hit communities across Ohio, where firefighters in Perry County alone carried out more than 50 water rescues between Saturday night and Sunday morning. One woman was found stranded on top of her car in floodwaters in a place called Thorne Township. The flood threat kept spreading into West Virginia and Kentucky, too. What started as a single-state story in Indiana had turned into a much bigger regional crisis, a Midwest water disaster spreading east right along with the weather system that caused it. Now let's travel 4,000 miles to the west to a completely different disaster with a completely different cause, but somehow the exact same devastating result. Hurricane Lala grew from a tropical storm into a full Category 1 hurricane on Saturday, August 15, 2026, as it approached the Big Island of Hawaii with winds reaching 75 miles per hour. The National Hurricane Center used the phrase life-threatening conditions to describe what was coming before the storm got close. Here's the strange part, though. Lala never technically made landfall. Its eye passed by the southern tip of the Big Island without ever actually crossing onto land. Forecasters had said before the storm arrived that a direct hit would have been Hawaii's first hurricane landfall in more than 30 years. The direct hit never happened. There is no official landfall point on record for this storm. Lala grazed the island rather than striking it, and it still managed to sweep occupied homes completely off their foundations. In the heaviest bands of the storm, rain was falling at rates of 3 to 5 inches per hour. Not 3 to 5 inches total for the whole day. 3 to 5 inches every single hour. Over the course of one day, some locations saw more than 2 feet of total rainfall. The mountains on the Big Island received more than 3.5 feet of rain, over 42 inches total. The mountains on Maui saw up to 2 feet of rain. Forecasters actually had to revise their maximum rainfall forecast upward from 25 inches to somewhere between 30 and 35 inches because the storm slowed down as it moved over the islands. When a storm slows down, all that rain keeps falling in the same spot instead of spreading out. It is the exact same basic idea that caused the stall over Indiana, just showing up in a totally different kind of storm, a slow-moving tropical cyclone instead of a stuck weather front. Hawaii County Mayor Kim Alameda said publicly that several occupied homes may have been completely swept off their foundations in the Nalaihu and Waiohinu areas. He described it as a river of water rushing through the Nalaihu area and washing away a huge amount of property. Hawaii County Civil Defense launched a joint search and rescue mission using county resources, the Hawaii National Guard, and the United States Coast Guard, all working together to try to reach people who had called 911 for help but could not be located because flooded roads and huge boulders were blocking the way in. Picture search and rescue teams working in the dark, moving through rushing water with giant boulders scattered across the roads, trying to reach people who had called for help and then gone silent because the cell towers had already gone down. One person died in a storm-related car crash on the Big Island. More than 100 homes were damaged or destroyed on Hawaii Island alone. 6 bridges were destroyed or nearly destroyed in the Kau area. Hawaii's Governor Josh Green described the scene in parts of the South as utter devastation. A section of the Pahala Highway completely collapsed overnight into Sunday, cutting off access to an area that includes one of the region's only hospitals. The collapse actually created a brand new waterfall where a road used to be. Hawaiian Airlines canceled 52 flights. Around 190 flights across the entire state were either canceled or delayed on Saturday alone. Every state office, county office, school, court, and judiciary office across Hawaii was closed on Monday. The same kind of scale applies to what happened in Hawaii, just with a different shape of danger. Search and rescue teams there were not just paddling down flooded streets. They were driving and hiking through terrain where boulders the size of cars had been pushed down mountainsides by rushing water, blocking roads that rescuers desperately needed to use to reach people who had already called for help. Imagine trying to get to a stranded family when the road itself has been replaced by a pile of rock and mud, or when a bridge that used to connect two sides of a valley simply is not there anymore. That is what 6 destroyed or nearly destroyed bridges in the Kau area actually means in practice. It does not just mean 6 inconvenient detours. It means entire communities were cut off from hospitals, from grocery stores, from fuel, and from the outside world at the exact moment they needed help the most. The collapse of a section of the Pahala Highway made this even worse, because that road was one of the only ways to reach a hospital serving that part of the island. When a highway collapses into a brand new waterfall, as this one did, ambulances cannot simply take a different street the way they might in a big mainland city with dozens of connected roads. On an island, especially in a rural area like this one, there often is no other road. And then there is the power situation, which is really where you start to understand just how serious this is because of how Hawaii's islands are built and connected, or rather, not connected. By Saturday night, more than 88,000 Hawaiian Electric customers had no power. By Sunday morning, that number had climbed to more than 178,000. By Monday morning, around 117,000 customers were still sitting in the dark across 3 separate islands, with 41,000 of those on the Big Island alone, mostly in places like Puna, North and South Kona, North and South Kohala, Hamakua, and South Hilo. The power company actually warned that some outages could last for months, not days, months. Here is why that word is not some kind of exaggeration. Hawaii's islands are not connected to each other by any power grid, and they are definitely not connected to anything on the mainland. When a storm hits the continental United States and knocks out power lines, utility companies can call for mutual aid, and trucks full of repair crews can drive in overnight from neighboring states to help out. That system is exactly how big power outages on the mainland usually get fixed within just a few days. That system simply does not exist for Hawaii. There's no road that leads from the mainland to Hawaii. Every repair crew, every replacement power pole, every transformer, and every giant spool of transmission line either has to already be sitting on that island, or it has to be flown in by plane or shipped in by boat. Hawaiian Electric had to request help from partner electric utilities on the mainland, and about 100 crew members were expected to arrive by Tuesday, just to begin working on Wednesday. They had to be flown in across the ocean. Two of the Big Island's largest independent power producers, called Puna Geothermal Venture and Hamakua Energy Partners, were completely disconnected from the grid because of storm damage. Wind energy providers on the island were knocked offline too. A 42-mile stretch of transmission line along the Hamakua coast needed a full assessment after falling trees took down multiple poles and support structures across that entire corridor. That is not just a scattered outage here and there. That is a total failure of the backbone of the power system. And on an island, when the backbone of your power system fails, you cannot just call the utility company 2 states over and borrow their trucks. Think for a moment about what it actually means for a power outage to last months instead of days, because most people who have only ever lost power for a few hours during a mainland thunderstorm do not have a real picture of what that looks like. No power for months means no refrigerator working for months, which means every family in that situation has to find new ways to keep food from spoiling day after day, week after week. It means no air conditioning through the hottest, most humid stretch of a Hawaiian summer in homes that were often built expecting the ocean breeze and ceiling fans to be enough, not knowing the fans themselves would have no power to run. It means students trying to do schoolwork by flashlight or by phone battery, if their phones even have a signal, since cell towers themselves depend on the same power grid that just failed. It means small businesses, the corner store, the local restaurant, the little shop that depends on a refrigerated case or a cash register or simply lights to stay open, sitting dark and losing income for weeks or months at a stretch. It means medical equipment that people depend on to stay alive, oxygen concentrators, refrigerated insulin, machines that help people breathe at night, all suddenly running on borrowed time from a generator, and a limited supply of fuel. This is not simply an inconvenience. For the most vulnerable people on these islands, the elderly, the very young, people with chronic illness, an extended outage like this one can become a matter of life and death, which is exactly why Hawaiian Electric, the National Guard, and the Coast Guard treated restoring power as such an urgent priority from the very first hours after the storm. The effects of a long power outage on an island start piling up fast, and they get worse the longer the power stays off. Losing power takes down water systems that rely on electric pumps to move water around. The Department of Water Supply actually issued a notice telling all customers to only use water for essential needs, meaning drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene only. A long outage also takes down refrigeration for food, which means food starts to spoil. It takes down refrigeration for medicine too, including things like insulin and other medications that cannot handle heat and will go bad without a working fridge. It takes down the cell towers that people rely on to call 911 when they are trapped somewhere. And those same towers are what emergency workers use to find people and coordinate rescues. Generators can cover some of this for a little while, but eventually they run out of fuel. And fuel has to arrive by ship too, just like everything else. None of these problems are totally unique to Hawaii. Every island in the world faces some version of this same challenge. What makes Hawaii's situation so severe is not the type of problem, it is the size of it, because in Hawaii, there is simply no road out and no quick fix trucking in from somewhere nearby. Governor Green estimated that the storm caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage across the entire state. That estimate was made on Sunday, while damage assessments using helicopters and drones were still being carried out across Hawaii Island and Oahu. The real final number is going to end up being even higher than that. It always is, once all the assessments are finally finished. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because these two disasters happened in the very same week, and it is worth asking what actually connects them and what all of it really means. These two disasters have absolutely nothing to do with each other when it comes to the weather itself. There is no shared storm system, no shared weather front, and no single weather pattern linking the middle of the country to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. One was a weather front that got stuck in place. The other was a spinning tropical storm system. They are two totally separate weather events with two totally separate causes. Anyone telling you these two storms were somehow connected or caused by the same exact weather system is not telling you the truth. But even though the causes were completely different, both disasters caused damage in almost exactly the same way. Neither one was really a wind story. Both of them were water volume stories, meaning the real danger in both places came from an overwhelming amount of water, not from strong winds knocking things down. And both of them smashed through benchmarks and records that local infrastructure had been built around for a very long time, in Indiana's case, for more than an entire century. There's another angle worth thinking about here, and it has to do with how differently these two disasters would have been covered if they had happened on their own in a normal week, without another massive story competing for attention at the exact same time. A flood that breaks a 113-year-old record through the second largest metro corridor in an entire state would, on its own, likely have dominated national news coverage for days. A hurricane that swept occupied homes off their foundations, destroyed bridges, collapsed a highway into a waterfall. and knocked out power to well over 100,000 people across 3 islands, would, on its own, likely have done the exact same thing. Instead, both of these disasters were fighting for space in the same news cycle, at the same time, 4,000 miles apart, which meant that many viewers only caught fragments of each story instead of the full picture of either one. That is part of why a video like this one matters. Because when 2 disasters this serious happen in the same weekend, it becomes very easy for the public to only absorb half of what is actually going on, and to miss just how many lives in just how many places were affected by water in a single 7-day stretch. There's also a really important lesson buried in all of this about how warning systems work and where they fail, and why an accurate forecast does not automatically mean people will actually stay safe. The National Weather Service office in Indianapolis had already upgraded their outlook for the White River from moderate to major flood severity, days before the actual crest even arrived, with flood warnings that were written to stay in effect through August 17th. Forecasters clearly published, well in advance, that the worst flooding had not even happened yet. The National Hurricane Center used the words life-threatening before Hurricane Lala even got close to Hawaii. Hawaiian Electric warned customers ahead of time about the possibility of extended power outages. In both cases, the forecast turned out to be completely accurate. The science worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The warnings were issued clearly and on time, and people still died. Homes were still destroyed, and more than 100,000 people are still sitting in the dark tonight. The gap between an accurate forecast and people actually staying safe is not really a forecasting problem at all. It is an infrastructure problem. It is a flood map problem. It is a problem about where people are legally allowed to build homes and under what conditions. It is a problem of mobile home communities being located inside floodplains with no extra elevation to protect them, and residents who might not even have a working vehicle to evacuate in. It is a problem with how Category 1 hurricanes get labeled, because that rating only measures sustained wind speed, and it tells you almost nothing useful about a rain rate of 5 inches per hour crashing down onto steep volcanic slopes just above a small coastal town. It is a problem of ordinary people hearing the phrase Category 1 and assuming that means it is survivable, because Category 1 is the lowest number on the entire scale, and survivable feels like a totally reasonable assumption to make about the lowest rung of a ladder, right up until 5 inches of rain per hour start pouring down a mountainside straight into your neighborhood. The Saffir-Simpson scale, which is the scale used to rate hurricanes, only measures one single thing, and that is sustained wind speed. A Category 1 storm has winds between 74 and 95 miles per hour. That is literally all that number is telling you. It told people almost nothing useful about the actual hazard that ended up killing someone and destroying homes in Hawaii, which was an extraordinary amount of rainfall falling onto steep volcanic terrain. That kind of terrain forces moist air to rise very quickly, which wrings even more rain out of the clouds, producing rainfall rates that are far higher than what the exact same storm would ever produce, over flatland or open ocean water. A Category 1 hurricane that never even technically made landfall caused all of this destruction. The category rating itself was not wrong or broken. It was simply measuring the wrong thing for this particular kind of danger. And back in Indiana, a severe thunderstorm warning is honestly one of the most routine, everyday alerts you can get in the American Midwest. People who have lived there their entire lives have probably heard that same alert hundreds of times without much happening. And yet, a stalled line of pretty ordinary thunderstorms just took down the single most famous flood record in that state's entire history. In both disasters, the public-facing warning ended up communicating something pretty close to the opposite of how serious the actual threat really was. There's one more idea worth explaining clearly before we get to where things stand today, because it trips up a lot of people. A so-called 100-year flood does not actually mean a flood that only happens once every 100 years. That is a really common misunderstanding, and it is honestly a pretty dangerous one. A 100-year flood actually means a flood that has a 1% chance of happening or being beaten in any single given year. That means 2 of them could technically happen in back-to-back years without anything being statistically wrong or unusual about it at all. But here's the catch. That 1% number is calculated using historical measurements from river gauges going back in time. And that calculation is built on an assumption that the weather patterns of the past are a fair and accurate sample of what the future is going to look like. Every floodplain map, every levee height, every drainage pipe size, every flood insurance rate map across Indiana, and a large chunk of local building codes, all of it sits downstream of that one basic assumption. So when a flood record that stood strong for 113 years suddenly falls to a weather mechanism that did not even set the original record in the first place, meaning rainfall by itself beating out rainfall combined with melting snow, that tells you the entire underlying assumption is now being seriously tested. So where do things actually stand right now as of today, August 18th, 2026? In Indiana, floodwaters along the White River are finally starting to recede, But the real damage assessment work is honestly just getting started. Officials in Hamilton County confirmed Sunday morning that the water was finally beginning to go back down. But recovery efforts along the entire White River corridor are still very much active and ongoing. The death toll currently stands at 7 confirmed victims, and that number could still move as more water continues to recede and recovery crews keep working through the affected areas. The joint damage assessments that will determine whether Indiana gets upgraded from a basic emergency declaration to a full major disaster declaration are already underway. Those assessments are the next big milestone everyone is watching closely. Until those numbers come back with an actual dollar figure attached, $5 million remains the entire federal amount on the table, against a flood that just broke a 113-year-old record running straight through the second largest metro area in the entire state. Meanwhile, the flooding threat has continued spreading east. Communities in Ohio were hit hard on Sunday night. This weather system is clearly not finished moving yet. Over in Hawaii, about 117,000 customers are still without power as of Monday morning. Repair crews managed to fix 3 major transmission lines on Sunday, which counts as one of the very first real steps toward rebuilding the backbone of the entire power grid. About 100 crew members from the mainland are expected to arrive on Tuesday and begin actual repair work on Wednesday. Damage assessments using helicopters and drones are continuing across both Hawaii Island and Oahu. More than 100 homes have been damaged or completely destroyed. 6 bridges were destroyed or nearly destroyed in the Kau area. The collapse of the Pahala Highway is still cutting off access to a hospital that serves that entire region. Every school and government office across the state remained closed on Monday. The governor's current damage estimate sits at hundreds of millions of dollars, and that number is almost certainly going to keep climbing higher. Hawaii's last hurricane landfall before this was Hurricane Iniki, back on September 11, 1992. That was a Category 4 storm that struck the island of Kauai, killed 7 people, and caused around $3.1 billion in damage, measured in 1992 dollars. That was 33 years and 11 months ago. Most people currently living on the Big Island have literally never lived through a hurricane in their entire lives. Preparedness naturally fades away across a gap in time that long. And Hurricane Lala tested that faded preparedness without even fully making landfall. Both of these disasters are still actively unfolding right now, even as you watch this video. Both recovery timelines are being measured in weeks, not just days. Both events broke straight through numbers that everyone assumed were solid and permanent. The levees built on old assumptions, the flood maps, the historical records, and the hurricane category scales, along with everything people assumed those scales actually meant. And in both places, the people who live there are now waking up to a completely different world, one where the old numbers simply do not apply anymore, where the benchmark they trusted is just gone, and where the basic assumption they built their entire lives around, the assumption of exactly where the water would stop, turned out to be completely wrong. The United States fought 2 massive federal scale disasters during this exact same weekend. 7 people dead in Indiana, 1 person dead in Hawaii, over 100,000 people still sitting without power, dozens of homes completely gone, an 18-year-old who should have been starting college in just a few short weeks, a 4-year-old boy who never even got the chance to grow up, a grandfather standing in his own home, staring at the water line on his walls on his 37th birthday, a county commissioner for whom a good morning now simply means that it is not raining anymore. Neither one of these stories is actually finished yet. The water is slowly going down in Indiana, and the power is slowly coming back on in Hawaii, but the real reckoning is honestly just beginning for both places. The damage assessments, the insurance battles, the tough questions about flood maps and building codes, and decisions about what actually gets rebuilt and where and under what new rules. Those difficult conversations are going to take years to fully play out, and the infrastructure decisions that come out of everything that happened this week are going to take decades to fully carry out. The numbers that just got broken this week are either going to get written into brand new maps, new floodplains, and new design standards going forward, or they are simply going to get ignored completely. And somewhere down the line, in 30 or 50 or maybe even 70 years from now, someone is going to stand in front of a camera just like this one and tell viewers that another record just fell. A record that traces all the way back to 2026, the year 2 disasters hit America at the very same time. We are going to keep tracking every part of this story, the damage assessments as they come in, the total recovery costs, the death toll if it changes again, the power restoration timeline across Hawaii, and the question of whether Indiana's emergency declaration finally gets upgraded into a full major disaster declaration. So make sure you stay with this channel because this story is far from finished, and neither one of these disasters is done with the people who actually lived through them.